The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales radio show with me, Charles Christian, as once again we bring you more weird tales for weird times. Let's start with a couple of news items, although one of them is actually more of a follow-up story. The first tale is a story reported by the British Museum in London, where an uninspiring lump of clay tablet engraved with Babylonian cuneiform script that's been sitting in the museum's vaults since the 19th century when it was first discovered has just been re-examined using better lighting and found that it contains a tiny drawing of a ghost. The tablet, about 3,500 years old, is part of an exorcist's guide to getting rid of unwanted ghosts, as opposed to, wanted ghosts. It's believed to be the earliest ever drawing of a ghost, so one for the Guinness Book of Records, and it depicts a lonely, miserable male ghost being led into the afterlife and eternal bliss by a female lover, also a ghost. The exorcist ritual explains that sometimes ghosts haunt the living because they are unhappy in the afterlife. So you fix them up with a ghostly bedfellow, a kind of ghostly Tinder, I suppose. Which sounds like a happy ending, but the ritual does end with the warning, do not look behind you. The story features in a new book, The First Ghosts, Most Ancient Legacies by Irvin Finkel, the curator of the British Museum's Middle Eastern Department and a world expert on cuneiform script. Now, next up, a couple of shows ago we talked about the origins of two local landmarks, Misery Corner and Hangman's Hill, close to where we record the Weird Tales radio show. This prompted Mike Freebury in Delaware to write in to say that his area of Delaware might beat us, as nearby they have a slaughter beach, a murder-kill river and a purgatory swamp road. I can just imagine the conversation people have around there. Should we go for a picnic on Slaughter Beach and then maybe do some fishing in the Murder-Kill River? We could meet up with Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees and Annabelle. She's such a doll. Right, let's get on with this week's interview. Making a welcome return to the show, our guest is Marc Hartzman. Marc has been described as one of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre and says his passion for the unusual began at an early age, influenced by Ripley's Believe It or Not and the annual Guinness Books of Records. Right, it's my great pleasure to be talking to Marc Hartzman again. How are you, Marc?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fine as well. Obviously, as ever, we are struggling with technology, but that's not the topic of today's conversation. You've got a new book out, Chasing Ghosts, just come out this month, is it?
Came out September 28th.
Oh, right, a month ago.
Just in time for Halloween.
Just in time for Halloween. And what is it? Ebook or paperback? What format?
It's paperback, but it's filled with illustrations, photos, old newspaper clippings, full color. It's a beautifully produced book.
Excellent. Now, you did vaguely mention this when we were speaking back in, I think it was March. And the subtitle is A Tour of Our Fascination with Spirits and the Supernatural.
Yes.
What got you interested in this? Because some of your other books are just more general weirdness, like The Big Book of Mars or The Embalmed Head of Oliver Cromwell, etc., and American Sideshows, all found on eBay. What got you interested in this topic?
Well, it definitely falls into the realm of the bizarre. So there's certainly that consistent thread through the things
Yes.
I like to write. But I'll say a few things. One is, the idea of ghosts it's something I've always been interested in. Since I was a kid, reading different books about ghosts and nonfiction about ghosts, not necessarily actual fiction ghost stories.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was always kind of fascinated by the possibility and the question of whether or not we might survive after death. And because I was curious about that, I had this fear that when we die and we're buried, that might be the wrong thing to do. And what if we do survive, our consciousness does survive, and it's trapped beneath 6 feet of dirt and in a box for eternity? And wouldn't that be horrible? And I kind of get into that concept in The Embalmed Head of Oliver Cromwell. So that's kind of stayed with me. But then what really got me going more so in terms of the book and really sparked the idea for the book, kind of building around it, was getting into the Victorian era spiritualism, late 1800s, early 1900s. And I started buying a lot of books from that era. Again, just late 19th century books. I love the titles of these books. I love the covers of them. And the stories within them are just fascinating. What these mediums were doing, how they were doing it, the people who were studying them, the scientists who believed them, and the messages they were giving from the dead, and who was coming back from the dead. The book gets into some of the notable names who returned from the dead, like Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe, and what they had to say and write, through Ouija boards and this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So all that just really fascinated me. This was a time when millions of people, followed spiritualism, considered themselves spiritualists, and truly believed that they could communicate with the dead. And, you mentioned my book on Mars. And one of the stories I loved in the Big Book of Mars was that same era when there was a strong belief in intelligent life on Mars and that people could communicate with Martians. And we were trying to figure out how to do that. And so I love this whole era, where people believed that we could talk to Martians and we could talk to the dead. And there were all this new technology that was coming out that was all sort of magical and wondrous. And so why might these things not be possible as well? Now we're taking photos, we have telephones, we're recording human voices. So it was just kind of a wondrous time to me. I often wonder what that must have been like, feeling confident that all these things were possible.
Yeah. Because, it was the Fox sisters, wasn't it, who really kicked it all off?
Yeah, they're basically considered the start of modern spiritualism in 1648 when they were in their home in Hydesville, New York. And these were two young kids. You say sisters, and yes, but they were very young. They were like around 11 and 13, and making these sounds, or hearing what they said they were hearing, basically knockings or rappings on, tables on the walls and so forth, and that this was a spirit communicating with them. They called him Mr. Splitfoot, who they said, according to Mr. Splitfoot, that he was a man who had been murdered and buried in the basement. They did, by the way, find some buried bones under the house later on, so that adds a little element of intrigue to it.
Yeah.
But their parents, believed that this was real, and they were a true overnight sensation. Where the next day, the whole neighborhood flocked to the house, like hundreds of people, and wanted to witness this and hear this communication from beyond. And from there, things really took off. Their older sister Leah had been living in Rochester, and she was about 20 years older, so she was an adult.
Yeah.
And she had a husband who had left her and a young child, so she was in a difficult position as a single mother in the mid 1800s. So she saw an opportunity with her younger sisters and what was going on in Hydesville, and she basically became their manager. And they went and toured around Rochester, made a ton of money holding seances. And then they did have people who were skeptical. There were some doctors who investigated them and, were pretty convinced that they were just using their knuckles or joints in a way to make these popping noises. That they could control it that easily and make these sounds. But they went to, people still believed. They didn't necessarily want to believe that it was fake. So they made their way to New York City, were successful in New York City, toured America, and crossed the pond over to England. And, were very successful throughout for decades.
Because, I mean, they were later revealed to have been faking it, or one of the sisters wrote a memoir sort of telling it all and admitting they'd been faking it. Is that right?
Yeah, well, in 1888, so 40 years later,
yeah,
there was a spiritualism convention in New York City, and they came clean, and they were demonstrating on stage like this is how it worked, and people didn't want to listen to that. The spiritualists, I mean, things, the ship had already sailed. There were too many people believing in this, too many mediums working, and they basically said, oh, now the Fox sisters are just trying to capitalize on not being spiritualists. but we know that you are. So the confession didn't really matter or help anyone.
Right. Right. I mean, presumably one of the things that got it really going in the United States was the aftermath of the war between the states, the Civil War, presumably where lots of people had lost loved ones, young ones, and the like, and the same way that there was a big rush for it in the UK after World War One. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think that gave it a real boost. I mean, it was going on already and it was spreading quickly, but then when you have these massive losses, from both events, Civil War and World War One, here too, then you have just a ton of people grieving and holding out hope and desire to still connect with lost loved ones, and so mediums were happy to oblige and help them. And so all of a sudden you have more mediums, happy to do what they can to say, sure, you can talk to this loved one and we'll work that out for you. So they were definitely opportunists at that time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things reading about it now and reading your book is that so many of the spiritualists were pulling hoaxes. I mean, some of them appeared to have genuine skills, but felt the need, because they'd got paying audiences, that they had to deliver, and so would resort to trickery if they couldn't make contact. But looking at it from this point in time, 21st century, you think, well, how did so many people fall for it when so many of them were bogus or, so outlandish? I mean, some of the things of playing trumpets and musical instruments and all manner of things. I mean, it sort of becomes a fairground attraction rather than seriously contacting the dead. What was the element that gave it its credibility, despite the fact it was fundamentally incredible?
Well, I think there's a few things going on there, and you were just covering numerous stories in my mind with what you were describing. So I'll try and hit on a few of these examples. So I think in terms of the instruments flying around, so that would be a good example of what the Davenport brothers were doing in the 1850s and beyond. But they got their start in the 1850s, following the Fox sisters, and they were, by the way, not far from the Fox sisters in Buffalo, New York. So this Western New York region was sort of a place of a lot of like religious reawakenings, and different modes of thought and ideas, and younger people kind of heading a little bit west. It was a bit of a gateway to the west from the East Coast. So the idea of sort of breaking from traditional thought, they were pretty open-minded about these things. Yeah. So I think there was some more willingness to believe in general that these things might be possible. Of course, part of it might have just been, hey, this is a great show, so let's go watch it.
Yeah, yeah.
So there might have been that as well. The Davenport brothers never actually came out and said, yes, we're spiritualists. They just sort of put on the show, and they had a talker who might say what he wanted to say, but the Davenports themselves didn't explicitly say that they were spiritualists. So I think there's an element of that. And then in terms of like those who seemed fairly genuine but would fake things at times, I mean, the great example of that is Eusepia Palladino, who was an Italian medium, and she was doing all kinds of amazing phenomena. She was very well known for table levitation, moving furniture, spectral hands, faces appearing. She even had a scar on her forehead that would emit like a cool breeze, which I picture like this weird Harry Potter scar. So all kinds of like strange things.
Through it, yes.
Yes, right. And she had a lot of scientists coming to investigate her. And certainly there were those who said, okay, I think all she's doing is this. She might be freeing up a foot, unbeknownst to everyone else in the room. And with that freed foot, she's able to do this and she's able to do that. Or different ways to manipulate her hands so that if everyone's holding hands, she can free up a hand and the people don't realize that her hand is suddenly missing just by how they're all positioned. I think that there's actually a diagram in the book that kind of shows how that was working. So there were things that they saw that she could be doing to make these effects happen. That said, one of the psychical researchers, a man named Hereward Carrington, he was completely convinced that she was legitimate. He brought her to the United States to have her tested by more people. And she was, again, she was puzzling many scientists, but again, there were those who kind of figured things out. But Hereward Carrington said, okay, you're right. She is faking it sometimes, but she's doing it because she can't always have spirits communicating on demand. So sometimes she has to please her audience, just like you were saying. So he accepted that might be perfectly fine, which makes you wonder, like, okay, well, maybe she's always doing that. It's hard to say for sure, but it's interesting that was an excuse that was accepted by some. There's another case I love of Henry Slade, Dr. Henry Slade, who was using spirit slates, slate writing. And he'd have like a little piece of chalk would be in a slate, be closed up. And, you might ask a question, a seance, have the slate underneath the table, and you'd hear some scritching and scratching. You pull the slate back out, and lo and behold, there's this message from the dead. And if the handwriting was really terrible, it looked even more authentic that it was from someone who was dead, because they probably wouldn't have great control over a small piece of chalk. But what he was doing was a few things he may have been doing. One is, if it was really sloppy writing, it might be because he had a thimble with a tiny piece of chalk on his finger that he would reach under and he'd write the message. He'd be able to, finagle that whole thing. Yeah. Which, to his credit, sounds like a pretty good skill. Most of these things that these mediums were able to do, to me, are almost just as impressive as actually talking to the dead. I mean, the skills they developed are pretty awesome and very entertaining. Sometimes he would just swap out a slate that's already filled out for the blank one. So there was that as well. And he did that at one seance where a guy caught him doing it because he found the slate beforehand and added a message to it and then put it right back. And then sure enough, he pulled out that slate and read from it and then found the extra message in it. And so he thought he had the guy caught. But then afterwards, Slade talked to him and explained that sometimes the medium, sometimes the spirits don't want to play and they get angry if things like that are happening. So they won't do something, and basically convinced this guy that he had mediumistic powers. And the guy went home and started practicing his own mediumship. So he talked his way out of it, which is really impressive.
Yeah.
Very skilled character, for sure. The other thing I'll say, just to add one last thought to that, is I think in cases like Eusepia Palladino and many of the other women mediums, and there were, I'd say probably majority of the mediums were women, partly because, just like I said with Leah Fox, like this was a new job opportunity. It was a new thing that they could do that gave them power. They didn't have to be relegated to the house or the few jobs that were available to women. Now you suddenly had power, and within a religion, no less. You were talking to the dead. So what you said mattered and people listened. So that was a really interesting position to be in. Plus it was lucrative. So, one of the thoughts that I thought was great that's in the book was from a performer and historian, Todd Robbins, was talking about the fact that you have all these brilliant scientific men who would never believe that a woman could fool them because they're so smart.
Right, yes.
And if you go in with that belief, then it's not so hard for the woman to fool them.
Yes.
Which I thought was a pretty good
good point. Take on
it.
Yes. But particularly, as you say, when you're talking of the 19th century where
exactly,
the woman's place was perceived to be definitely in the home. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Times.
Yeah. What sort of money did they make? I mean, obviously, you've got to account for inflation and things, and currency changes, but were they, making substantial amounts?
I think in some cases they were. I know I mentioned in the book, Eusepia Palladino was getting, I think, hundreds of dollars per seance from the nobility in Italy in her early years.
Yeah.
So there were definitely wealthy families paying her quite a bit to come perform. Offhand, I don't think I have figures offhand of some of the other mediums, but certainly they were doing well enough to, to travel and make a pretty decent living. There was one character, Daniel Douglas Hume, D.D. Hume, as he's more commonly known, who actually pretty much he was starting just before the Fox sisters. And he would not charge anything for his services, but he would get room and board. People would give him gifts. He traveled a lot to Europe, and, he might take expensive gifts from people.
Yep.
Who were happy to offer him these things. And he was really well known for his levitation skills. And there's some great stories in the book about how he was able to levitate, out a window and back through another window at a very, high level of a particular home. So he was a pretty skilled medium who, basically it was like, I work for free, which made him sound more legitimate. Another one I'll say, just in terms of that concept, was Marjorie, Mina Crandon, who's known as Marjorie, the Witch of Lime Street in Boston in the 1920s, who really was well known for facing off against Houdini. And she started doing seances just for, her family, basically, and maybe some close friends, but not for money. So she wasn't in it for the money. She was more about bringing back her deceased brother, I think primarily to help her mother, who was grieving. And her mother believed that her brother Walter was coming back through these seances. And I think Marjorie kept doing it because it was helping her mother. And it just kind of spiraled, I think, from there. Then people started taking notice. And that's when she actually took on the name Marjorie, was to just give herself some privacy. So she wasn't known as Mina Crandon, the medium, kind of separate her, this particular mediumship life from her private life. But of course, press caught wind of who she was, and that didn't work anyway. But then, there's this contest from Scientific American where they were looking for a genuine medium, and the prize money was $2,500. And some of the one of the judges was from Harvard and had found out about Marjorie and suggested that she enter. Arthur Conan Doyle also was aware of her and suggested that she enter. So she did, and that's when Houdini was on the panel, and of course that's when Houdini faced off against her and tried to expose what she was doing, because everyone else on the panel was convinced that she was real.
Yeah.
So she wasn't really about making money. She was just doing it for other reasons.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is that one of the things, like with the Fox sisters as well, that once they start doing it, they can't back down? A bit like some of the reports you hear about poltergeists, where it's a young girl is later discovered to be making all the noises and doing everything. That, I don't know, they can't back down, or they love the attention.
I think, I think there's some of that. And in the Fox sisters' case, their sister Leia was making the profit off it, so she kept it going. She's like, oh, we're not stopping this, this cash cow, so let's keep doing this. I also think that adding to the whole believability of everything was the fact that these were two young girls, and people didn't believe that they could be fraudulent. Why would these two young girls ever lie?
Yeah.
They're just young children. That doesn't happen here. So I think there was part of that helped make things really believable. In fact, I have a quote from Houdini where he talks about that, which, hang on, I'm just trying to find it really quick in the book. But he says, sorry, here it is. So the father's name was John Fox. Houdini says, John Fox and his wife appear to have been of the, quote, good, honest, but not mentally keen type of farmer folk. Of the two, the wife was the more simple-minded. And when the nervous, superstitious woman began to hear unusual noises, which she could not account for, and which seemed in some peculiar manner connected with her children, she concluded at once that the sounds were, quote, unnatural, and began to brood over the matter. Her fears increased with the persistent recurrence of the mysterious sounds, and before long she took some of the neighbors into her confidence. They were as puzzled as the mother. The Fox home became an object of suspicion, and the neighborhood set itself the task of solving the mystery. The possibility of duplicity in such children never occurred to anyone in Hydesville.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing when you consider that the Salem witch trials were largely prompted by accusations by young children.
That's right.
That they later admitted, oh, we made it all up.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry about that. all you lot who got hanged, yes. But yeah, it seems that, you know, there's no institutional memory that kids might do this. It just seems to take everybody by surprise.
Yeah, this innocence of children.
Yeah. I mean,
they were just, I think, playing, you know, having fun,
yeah,
just making a joke.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that also one of the thoughts? We're slightly away from your book here, but with the Bell Witch in Tennessee, which was more of a poltergeist thing, that again, it was one of the children, wasn't it? Or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the belief, is that the young girl, Betsy, was responsible for everything. And I think she would have been around 13, 14. The typical thing is it's teenagers, you know, entering puberty.
Yeah.
And that's where they believe that this sort of energy is manifesting itself and coming out in this recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis for parapsychologists who study this. Whether they're faking it or not, I mean, there's certainly beliefs that they're faking it. The Enfield case, you know, which happened in just north of London, that was believed that these girls were faking it, and the girls admitted that they faked sometimes for the same reason you mentioned earlier, because there was this demand to see things. But at the same time, early on in the case, you have all these amazing phenomena that they were producing, where, you know, furniture sliding across the room, the voices, and the police stated that they saw the furniture move and saw no way in which it was being manipulated. So, you know, it's definitely a curious case as to if they were doing it, how were they doing it?
Yeah.
Or does RSPK, is that like a thing that can really happen? And certainly a lot of people believe that as well.
Yeah. So,
I mean, I'm not trying to judge either way. I just find the stories, I love the fact that these stories happen, and they're so interesting to share and show both sides of it. And I didn't mean to get away from the Bell Witch, but the Bell Witch one is so interesting because in a similar way to Enfield, you know, furniture is moving. There's physical marks on the children, you know, looks like they've been slapped by the ghost. There's red marks, voices, whisperings, gossip about other people in town. There's all kinds of amazing stories. And it ends with the murder of her father. Basically, the ghost, in this case, the ghost actually kills Mr. Bell. So that's a really curious case for sure. Of course, this is early 1800s, and none of this was written down for about 30 years, if I remember correctly, off the top of my head, when the youngest of the children wrote this down as a story of their family. So again, you know, there's maybe you have to decide if you believe everything he wrote down, and things got twisted over the years, maybe sensationalized a little bit. But certainly it's remained an interesting case for centuries now.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things I find intriguing, and you've already mentioned Arthur Conan Doyle, is that people with a very prominent public profile got involved, were enthusiasts for it, if not obsessed by it. I mean, Conan Doyle also got caught up with the Cottingley fairies, which, again, when you look at it and you think, well, they're so obviously cardboard cutouts, you know, how did people fall for it? And again, we have, you know, one of the sisters in later life saying we made it all up, and then almost on their deathbed saying, but a couple of them were genuine, and so on. So it's just...
And they were children also.
They were children also, yes, indeed. Well, I suppose it's the equivalent of multi-billionaires these days being obsessed with space rockets, I suppose. But, you know, that such high-profile people got involved with these cases, as opposed to going, ooh, this sounds a little bit flaky, and tiptoeing away.
Yeah, I mean, Doyle is such an interesting case. I think with him, first of all, I love the fact that obviously he's best known for creating Sherlock Holmes, yet he had these really lackluster detective skills, like you were just talking about, the fairies and the spirits and so forth. But I think part of it is the time of everything, right? Like we talked about that earlier with what was going on,
Yes.
Context in the world. So you have these new technologies sprouting up around you, which are invisible, right? Like voice traveling is basically, that's invisible. Radio,
yes,
signals are traveling. You can't see them, but voices are moving. So I think there's just something to the fact that the idea that maybe we could, photography too, all of a sudden you have a print of a person on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
It's captured something. And there's spirit photography, which, I'm sure we might want to get to as well. But so there are these just things going on in the world that seem very wondrous. And so maybe the idea that we could communicate beyond the veil wasn't as incredibly far-fetched as it might sound, now. Maybe it felt like this is just the next breakthrough. So I think there's a little bit of that. So Doyle, though, just to give his more specific story, he went to his first seance in 1880 and was really sort of impressed by that. And it sat with him, I think, and he stayed interested. But it wasn't until his son Kingsley died in World War I, and he believed that he communicated with his son through a medium, that he was really convinced that this was definitely like the most important thing in humankind and the biggest news, in all of humanity, that this was possible and that we could communicate with lost loved ones through these mediums. And that's when he really became an evangelist for spiritualism. He toured and lectured across Europe and across America, wrote lots of books on the subject as well. And yeah, he was convinced right up to the end. Even after Marjorie, Houdini had shown that, this is how she's doing things. He thought Houdini had mediumistic powers. And Houdini said, no, I don't. Like, I'm telling you, I don't. I know how to do these tricks. That's all. It's not a genuine power. So Doyle was not even wanting to listen to that. So yeah, he was convinced. He had an ancient spirit named Phineas, that was advising him and his wife on all sorts of things like travel plans and real estate and homes that they should be buying, and believed that this spirit was communicating to them all the time about just daily life. So yeah, he was definitely bought into the whole thing.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
What other senior people were interested in it? Any politicians come on your radar, took an interest in it?
There were certainly people in Congress who were using mediums. I didn't get into specifics in the book, but I do talk about a hearing in Congress about the idea of, maybe there should be some laws against this. And one of the mediums talks up saying that she works with all different kinds of congressmen, so they were definitely using mediums in their work. Mary Todd Lincoln, not that she was the politician, but Abraham Lincoln's wife was very well known to be a spiritualist. And she had several mediums who would do seances at the White House. Abe may have attended a few, maybe just to, please his wife. I don't think he really believed it himself. But there's a case I talked about in the book where one of the mediums was also friends with John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Lincoln. And I think they were like drinking buddies. And so it's quite possible. And Booth believed in spiritualism. So that's why, he had befriended this medium. And it's quite possible that he may have shared some of his plans with this medium. And when the medium tried to warn Lincoln that there was danger ahead, I think Lincoln kind of brushed it off because he knew he was in a dangerous position for what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
He knew that there were people who did not like his position.
Yeah.
So it wasn't shocking news to hear that he might be in danger. Like, of course I'm in danger.
Yeah.
Thanks. But then, of course, shortly after, Booth assassinates him. So you do wonder, like, did he actually know real information that he was trying to pass along versus it coming just from another medium or something? So yeah, there's interesting cases. And of course, there's politicians coming back from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of that. I have some examples of course, Lincoln coming back to impart some wisdom on the living, and George Washington as well. mediums loved bringing back politicians who could maybe help the nation. That was a big thing at the time, of course. And Queen Victoria was a huge spiritualist.
Yes. Well, I mean, she was, again, bereaved relatively young and grieved over the loss of Albert for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah, she would communicate with Albert through the medium and, get advice from him on policy, which I think is pretty amazing.
Oh, dear. It's shaking head with disbelief. But, of course, we did have, I seem to recall, wasn't one of the more recent, was it Ronald Reagan's wife used to consult a spiritualist or a medium or something, while Ronald was still alive and while they were in the White House. I seem to recall tales of that.
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about Nancy Reagan. I didn't get into that. I didn't get into the more contemporary presidents.
Now, you've mentioned spirit photography. And again, this is one of these things where you look at it with modern eyes, and obviously they didn't have Photoshop in those days. Heaven help us if they had Photoshop in those times. But again, they look so hokey, double exposure-y, models being put in place, dummies in place and things. Yet again, everybody talked about it and thought it was further proof, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love the photos. I think they're incredible. They're so creative, really beautifully done. The first one, who really kind of launched this idea of spirit photography was William Mumler, who was in Boston. And he just sort of came across this spirit, figure behind him during a self-portrait. And his spiritualist friend said, like, oh, I think you're onto something here. You should make more of these. And Mumler was like, what? I think he just realized there was an accident with the plates that he was developing.
Yeah.
But he continued to produce these photos. And there's some remarkable stories about him where other photographers who would doubt his abilities would invite him to their studios and say, here, use my equipment and see if you can replicate it. And he would. And they were like, what? How is this happening? And then you had a lot of people who swore that the people that they saw in the photos were their lost loved ones or friends. And there were some cases where, it might be a child who had passed away and they swore it was their child in the photo. And there was no existing photo of this child beforehand. Because, photography wasn't that popular. I mean, it was, I should say, it wasn't that accessible.
Yes.
Right. It was, it was a luxury if you had a photo.
It was only in the late 1840s, really, that it first started coming in, isn't it? I mean, it's a relatively recent. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Mumler was 1861 when he started.
Yeah.
It was fairly, recent technology. But again, recent technology. So the idea that the camera could see things that the eyeball couldn't seemed plausible. If you kind of bought into the idea of communicating with the dead, that this seemed like, wow, now we can go even further with it. This was like another breakthrough. So there's a lot of excitement. But then, so Mumler, eventually there was a case against him. The government thought he was fraudulent and they brought him to trial. He actually was exonerated because no one could actually prove what exactly he was doing. But then his business kind of faded after that. But over in England, you had William Hope was making some pretty incredible spirit photographs. And then there was a Parisian photographer I mentioned. There were a bunch of them, by the way. I've just highlighted a few in the book. But there was one, Edouard Bouguet, who was producing some very beautiful spirit photography. And he was also brought to court as a fraud. And he admitted that he had a team and he had props, all these assistants. They brought some of the props in the court, showed how they were doing it. But he also had people testifying that he was legitimate by saying, no, I recognize this person. And so part of that might be, if you want to, you see what you want to see. Your mind believes what it wants to believe. So there might be an element of that. And then there was a great example I give also of a pretty prominent spiritualist named William Stainton Moses, who had investigated 120 of Bouguet's photos and confirmed that 40 of them showed people known to be deceased. So therefore, how could this be faked?
Yeah.
And so when it was found that, he had confessed and everything, Moses still didn't believe it. he was convinced that either Bouguer had been bribed to tell the truth or was just put under too much political pressure. And that's why he caved and confessed. But Moses, I think he was just like, well, I'm not going to be made a fool of. So, yes, it's real.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah. Talking of props and things, that sort of nicely brings us on to ectoplasm, doesn't it? And again, looking at some of the ectoplasm that spiritualists produce, again, to us, looks to be completely implausible. And, there's lots of tales about them using linen and plaster Paris and all manner of things. But when you read the accounts, they appear to be producing ectoplasm from some very unusual orifices, to put it politely.
Yes. Yeah. They could hide things in their orifices. And there's a case of Eva C., who might be the one you're speaking of specifically, in Paris, who would produce all kinds of ectoplasm. In some cases, you would actually see, I think sometimes it was like chewed up paper, regurgitated or hidden inside an orifice. And you could see that there was like the name of the newspaper, the magazine it came from, like the title was there. One of the cutouts, like pictures of faces cut out for the magazines. I mean, it is crazy. But what's interesting about her is the doctor investigating was so convinced of this, and he would inspect her before she'd go into the spirit cabinet and produce this ectoplasm. And the woman inspecting her was basically Eva's lover. So they had this relationship going on, and they'd have these inspections in their orifices, and the woman would come out and say, "Oh, she's clean," and the doctor would watch what happened and take his notes and write up his what had happened, the descriptions of the events. But maybe this was just the two of them. Maybe there was a little collaboration going on and a little bit of pleasure involved in the whole thing anyway. So yeah, it's just a strange dynamic. And again, maybe she had some regurgitation powers as well. I mean, there's certain people who can swallow things and bring them up on command. That's a sideshow skill that people have done throughout history. So she may have learned to do some of that and just bring things up and produce this effect. But yeah, ectoplasm's pretty crazy stories about that for sure.
Yeah. Now, one thing I found particularly fascinating about your book is you talk about the various gadgets people were experimenting with to communicate with the dead. So we're cutting out the spiritualist and we're just using the technology. Now, I mean, I used to read years ago those Carnacki, the ghost finder or ghost hunter books, and he's always got strange electric gadgets, but those were stories written in the early years of the 20th century when a lot of this technology was new and the element of mystery. But I didn't realize that there were lots of serious attempts to create technology to talk to the spirit world.
Yeah, there were lots of machines trying to hoping to capture evidence. So again, we talked about Hereward Carrington earlier. He had all kinds of gizmos he was using to try to capture evidence. One of them was called the Psychic Howler, and it was this instrument that was it was something that was used. It had this amazing sensitivity that could pick up like energy from heartbeats and things like this, and register it. So he thought, well, if it could do that, maybe it can pick up the energy of a ghost if it passes through, and if so, it would set up this loud noise to alert them that something had just passed through, and that would be some evidence that a ghost had been present. There's a few other examples they give in the book as well of just some really interesting contraptions to try to capture it. One of the stories I love too is Thomas Edison tried to create a spirit phone in October 1920. He made this announcement. Some people believe that this may have just been a joke on his part, capturing some headlines. But there's also evidence that he was actually experimenting with this in a lab with other scientists, years later. So, and he wrote about it years later as well. So it's hard to know 100%, how serious he was with this particular invention, but he certainly talked at length about it. And his thought was that spiritualists, if the dead were going to speak to us, he thought it was ridiculous that they would do it through things like Ouija boards. and other sorts of gizmos. Like, why would they do that? They would do something he thought would be more scientific. So yeah, he was trying to work on some sort of machine that would have, like Carrington, some sort of amazing sensitivity to be able to capture, a voice or some kind of a breakthrough. So I love that story. I love that he was looking into this idea. If someone was going to do it, it seemed like Edison was a good candidate. There was another case similar to that in the late 70s, early 80s by a guy named George Meek, who created what was called the Spiricom. And this was a guy who made a lot of money in the air conditioning business and then decided to invest it into the idea of communicating with the dead.
As you would.
Yeah, I mean, he truly believed that there was, consciousness survived, yes, and that there was another plane beyond the veil. So he wanted to explore this further, and so the Spiricom was part of that. And he hired a electronics whiz who was also a medium to help build this Spiricom machine. And Meek would just basically fund it. He wasn't working with this guy whose name was O'Neill, and basically he produced this machine and had these recordings from all these different deceased people, and it sounded like the voice sounded like it was from an electrolarynx. And they produced this packet. It was copyright free, so anyone could create their own Spiricom. He had a press conference announcing this amazing breakthrough, played a bunch of the tapes. Press wrote about it, because it was a curious thing, of course.
Yeah.
But it was later figured out that, first of all, Meek hadn't actually been present for any of these recordings, and that this electronics whiz he hired actually did have an electrolarynx, and also was found to be schizophrenic, and also skilled in ventriloquism. So, and also he was in need of money, so he may have just been doing this to keep the paychecks coming in. So we got, he thought we had it, but we still haven't gotten there.
Yeah. Because, paranormal investigators, some of them are very keen on the idea of these spirit boxes, aren't they? And really working on the same idea that you can scan certain wavelengths and you will detect anomalies that can't be explained.
Yeah, and I spoke with several paranormal investigators who've used them and have EVP recordings that are, pretty interesting, pretty convincing, that they seem to be actually answering questions. And one of them, went as far as to have voice prints taken of everybody in his group so that when you got the recording, you could test it and make sure that this wasn't one of them just saying something, that it was a unique voice coming through. So there have been some studies or some efforts to prove the authenticity of EVPs. But the story I wrote about that I really thought was interesting was a couple paranormal investigators who were working at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado. Stanley is best known for the hotel where Stephen King stayed and was inspired to write The Shining.
Right.
So it's known to be haunted.
Yeah.
I've been there. I've taken the ghost tour. I didn't see anything myself, but it's a pretty great ghost tour. People have their EVP recorders, their spirit boxes on the tour. But they did. So they were doing that for years, and they had befriended these ghosts. They felt certain that there were certain spirits there that they were in communication with, but they kind of gotten quiet. So one night after work, they decided, they thought, well, maybe the ghosts are just tired of these tours coming through, and that same thought of having to perform, Yeah. So they developed this technique, which is now called the Estes Method, since it was created there. But they would have someone with the spirit box might ask a question to the spirit, but he would be separate from the guy who would listen for the answers that came through the spirit box. So the listener would have headphones on and a blindfold, so he'd have sensory deprivation. He would only listen to whatever came through that spirit box. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he heard something, he would shout it out. So he doesn't know what's being asked. He's just shouting stuff out as he hears it. And then afterward, you compare, okay, well, here's what was said, and here's what was asked. Mm-hmm. And you find if there's any connection. And they found connections. One case they talked about someone just held up 4 fingers and said, how many fingers am I holding up? And he hears these voices coming through where he's saying, what, you want numbers? And starts rattling off a bunch of numbers. And, afterward jokingly said, I was hoping you asked me for the lottery numbers or something. But it's interesting that numbers came through when the question was, how many fingers am I showing? I also have some interesting cases in the book from someone at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia who used the same method and also got some pretty startling results from it. So it leaves, again, all of these stories. Like I said, I'm not saying one way or the other for sure. I'm presenting evidence, interesting stories where this is how this may have happened. This is how this person may have been proven fraudulent. And here's stories where, we're not quite sure how this happened, but this happened, which to me makes it really quite interesting. I mean, there's some cases where technology shows how something you thought was paranormal might not be paranormal.
Yeah.
One of the gizmos people might use in ghost hunting is an EMF meter checking for electromagnetic fields. And that might not be necessarily capturing a ghost, but it might explain that, maybe this EMF level here is what's causing someone to have a paranormal experience.
Yes.
If you remove this aspect, or from that place or whatever, or don't sleep on this side of the bedroom because there's EMFs behind the wall over here from some machinery or something.
Yeah.
Things stop. So there's some good examples of that. Infrasound is a great example. You don't detect it, but this 18.9 hertz happens in places where people often are considering to be haunted. Like there's a haunted cellar from an old 14th century cathedral in England. And the guy who kind of uncovered this, his name was Vic Tandy. And he tested for infrasound and found infrasound there. Also narrow hallways. So these places are sort of haunted house or haunted tropes. Sometimes infrasound is present, and that might be why people think they're seeing something paranormal. So again, doesn't explain everything by any means, but maybe explain some things, which I think is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I mean, with so many of these tales, there is some factual element buried in there that's just been misinterpreted. Yeah, no, that is fascinating. Yes.
Yeah.
We're almost coming towards the end of the show, so quick roundup. What are you doing next? As I'm sure you haven't hung up your word processor.
No. No. I'm working on a new book now, actually, also with Quirk Books. So I'm excited about that. And this one will be on UFOs. Actually just got back from a press conference about from some retired United States Air Force captains talking about aliens tampering with nuclear missiles in the 1960s. So that was pretty fascinating. So yeah, it's just getting underway, but that's been another fascinating topic to work on. So I'm excited to keep researching and doing more interviews and writing it all down. So it's going to be great.
Will that be for next year or the year after?
Yeah, right now we're set for summer 2023.
Well, Mark, once again, many thanks for your time. And your book is called Chasing Ghosts, A Tour of Our Fascination with Spirits and the Supernatural. And you kindly sent me a PDF of it, and it's an excellent book. As you say, fully illustrated and lots of little takeaway points here, there and everywhere. And I found it a fascinating read, and worked my way all the way through it. So,
thank you.
Excellent book. And good luck with the next one on UFOs, chasing UFOs, possibly.
Yes.
Okay then, Mark. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey guys, news! The title is Shuckland, and it's a brand new book by Charles Christian. It takes you on a journey through the weird wonders and intriguing mysteries of the Waveney Valley. Explore with Charles the truth behind the notorious Black Shuck of the book's title. Be transported to a world of demonic entities, murderous earls, ley lines, witchcraft, paganism, and discover the facts behind the outrageous legends and folklore of this seemingly peaceful corner of England. Shuckland is a 200-page illustrated paperback available through bookshops and online via Amazon and Books, etc., as well as the Urban Fantasist website at www.urbanfantasist.com. Shuckland is priced at $12.95, and there's an ebook version available on Amazon priced just £3.25. Shuckland, get yours today.
Once again, a big thank you to this week's guest, Marc Hartzman. You can find him on his website, which is at markhartzmanbooks.com. And we'll also have this link and a link to his Amazon book page on the Urban Fantasist website, as well as in the podcast and YouTube metadata. Now, what about my comment last time that this would be the last ever Weird Tales radio show? Well, sadly, it's true. I've been producing the show on a regular weekly basis for 4.5 years, and it's time for me to move on and do something new before I risk getting stale and boring you all, which we wouldn't want. I have a number of book projects on the cards, including an almanac of witches and sorcerers, plus another in my Haunted Landscapes series. Got those to write, so I certainly won't be getting bored. And I've also got a busy schedule shooting new videos for my YouTube channel. Don't worry. The entire Weird Tales radio show archive, dating back to the summer of 2017, will continue to be available across all podcast platforms and on the Urban Fantasist website and in an audio-only format on the Weird Tales Show YouTube channel. Now, in the words of the old Peter Cook and Dudley Moore song, it's time to say goodbye. Before I go, can I give you all a big round of applause for being such a fantastic and loyal audience over the years, and may you also enjoy this week's festivals as we slide into the darker half of the year. Whether you call it Halloween, Hallowmas, All Hallowtide, November Eve, Mischief Night, Samhain, All Hallows Eve, All Saints Eve, Zaduski Eve, the Festival of the Dead, La Dia de los Muertos, Punky Night, or even Nutcrack Night, as it was known 200 years ago because people used to eat so many nuts and apples on that evening. Whatever you call it, may all your jack-o'-lanterns burn brightly. Till the next time we meet, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.